The butler's words fell into the quiet warmth of the room and shattered it. "Her name, sir, is Miss Evelina Ward." For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The crackle of the fire, the frantic drumming of the rain against the window panes, the sound of my own breath, it all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of pure, cold shock. The warmth from Calder's hand, which had been a comforting anchor moments before, now felt like a brand. My lie was no longer a story I had told. It was a person. It was a woman standing in the foyer of this house, real and undeniable, and she was here to claim the life I had stolen. I felt the shift in Calder's grip, his fingers tightening on mine, not with anger, but with a sudden, sharp tension, as if bracing for a physical blow. I chanced to look at his face. The weary tenderness that had been there moments ago was gone, replaced by a pale, stunned disbelief. Then, that disbelief curdled into something far worse, something that cut me deeper than any accusation ever could. It was hurt. The raw, profound hurt of a man who had just offered his complete trust, only to have the ghost of the lie materialize at his door. "Calder, I whispered, the words a desperate, useless plea. "I never meant—" A violent clap of thunder rattled the very foundations of the house, swallowing my voice whole. The storm outside was a perfect mirror for the chaos that had just been unleashed within. Calder pulled his hand from mine, the loss of his touch leaving my skin cold. The fragile peace we had found was over. The war had begun again. He stood, his movements stiff, the master of the hall once more. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, strained whisper that held no room for argument. He turned and left the room without another look at me, closing the door with a quiet, final click. I was alone, trapped in the silent aftermath, my mind racing in a frantic, terrifying loop. How? How is this possible? Mrs. Langston. It had to be her. A counterattack. A move on the chessboard so brilliant and so cruel it left me breathless. She had found the real Evelina Ward and summoned her here as a weapon, a living, breathing testament to my fraud. Every second that passed was an agony. I strained to hear voices from downstairs, but there was only the roar of the wind and the rain. I imagined the scene in the foyer. The pale, shivering woman clutching her letter, Mrs. Langston appearing behind her like a triumphant spectre, and Calder standing between them, caught in a trap I had set. The guilt was a physical weight, threatening to suffocate me. I had not only endangered myself, I had brought this ruin down upon the man who had just saved my life. The door opened again. It was Calder. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes were a storm of conflict. "My mother requests your presence," he said, his voice flat. "In the drawing room." It was not a request. It was a summons to my own execution. I tried to push myself up, but my body was still weak from the poison, my limbs trembling. He was at my side in an instant, his hands strong and steady as he helped me to my feet, wrapping a heavy wool shawl around my shoulders. He was still protecting me, a gesture of instinct that defied the logic of the situation. He was holding me up, quite literally, as my world came crashing down. The walk to the drawing room was a funereal procession. Every step felt heavy, final. We entered. The scene before me was a perfectly staged piece of theatre. A young woman, pale, plainly dressed, and shivering from the cold, stood near the door, clutching a damp letter in her hand as if it were a holy relic, and by the roaring fire, looking as if she had been born to command such moments, was Mrs. Langston. She was no longer a prisoner in her rooms, she was a queen on her throne, and I was the traitor being brought before her. Her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only the chilling promise of victory. "How curious," she said, her voice like silk and steel. "It seems we have an abundance of companions. 2 Miss Wards." Her cold eyes swept from my face to the other woman's. "Which of you will be so good as to explain first?" The other woman flinched, looking terrified and overwhelmed. The guilt was a tidal wave, and it washed over me, pulling me under. This was my fault. All of it. I owed Calder the truth. All of it. Right now. I took a shaky step forward, pulling away from Calder's supporting arm. "I can explain," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It was I who—" "Not tonight." The command was quiet, but it cut through the tense room with absolute authority. Calder stepped in front of me, a human shield. A firm, steadying hand found my arm, stopping me. He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed on his mother, a look of cold, unwavering defiance in his eyes. "This discussion is over," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The woman you invited into this house is recovering from a serious illness and is in no condition to be interrogated." He glanced at the real Evelina Ward, his tone softening only slightly. "You will be given a room for the night. The storm has made the roads impassable. This will be sorted in the morning." He then turned to me, his hand still a warm, protective weight on my arm. In front of his mother, in front of my living, breathing lie, he made his choice. His touch was a public declaration. "Let's get you back to your room," he said, his voice low and meant only for me. He led me from the room, leaving Mrs. Langston and the other Evelina standing in a stunned, furious silence. The battle lines had been drawn, not in the shadows, but in the firelight for all to see. He had chosen the imposter. He had chosen me, and I knew, as he guided my trembling body back down the hall, that his protection was the only thing in the world that now stood between me and utter ruin. Calder led me back to the guest chamber, the silence between us heavy with all the things we couldn't say. At the door, he paused, his hand still a steadying presence on my arm. "Lock this behind me," he said, his voice low and firm. "No matter what you hear, do not open it for anyone but me." His stormy eyes held mine, and in their depths I saw a grim, protective resolve that was as terrifying as it was comforting. "We will face this in the morning. Together." He left, and I locked the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing the frantic slamming of my own heart. Sleep was an impossible luxury. I paced the floor of the room like a caged animal, my mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. Calder had chosen me. In front of everyone, he had chosen me. The fierce, irrational joy of that knowledge was immediately drowned by a wave of shame. He had chosen a lie, and in the morning, that lie would be laid bare for all to see. The house was quiet, but it was the waiting, listening quiet of a predator. I knew Mrs. Langston was in her rooms, plotting her next move. I knew the other Evelina Ward, the real one, was somewhere under this same roof, a living ghost come to reclaim her name. The room, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't just wait for my ruin to be served to me with breakfast. Drawn by an instinct I didn't understand, I found myself slipping out of my room and moving silently through the dark, sleeping house. There was only one place I wanted to be. The one place that had ever felt like it held any truth. The library. The room was dark, save for the embers of a dying fire that cast a soft, pulsing red glow over the hearth. I saw him almost immediately. He was standing with one hand braced on the marble mantelpiece, staring down into the flames. The firelight cast his face in a stark relief of shadow and light, and in its glow, I saw the immense weight he was carrying. His coat was gone, his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and he looked less like the master of an estate and more like a man preparing for a bare-knuckle brawl. He looked exhausted. He must have heard me enter, but he didn't turn. He just spoke to the fire, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I knew you wouldn't be able to sleep." "Neither could you," I whispered, moving to stand a few feet away from him, drawn to the meagre warmth of the fire. We stood in silence for a long moment. The only sounds the soft hiss of the embers and the relentless drumming of the rain against the tall library windows. He had heard my confession in the fevered haze of my recovery, but I needed to give it to him again, properly. I needed him to have the whole, unvarnished truth before the morning came, so he could make his choice with clear eyes. "When I was in my room," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper, "I felt the need to tell you again. So you know it wasn't the fever speaking." He finally turned his head, his gaze meeting mine. He didn't speak, He just listened, giving me the space to unburden my soul. And so I told him. Everything. I told him about the biting London cold, the gnawing hunger, the landlord's final pitiless warning. I described the moment the letter arrived, how the thick cream-coloured paper felt like a passport to another world. I confessed the desperate, foolish hope that I could simply borrow another woman's life for a short time, just long enough to get back on my feet, and then vanish. I didn't offer excuses. I didn't ask for pity. I just gave him the raw, shameful truth of my cowardice and my desperation. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute, so profound I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. He turned fully from the fire to face me, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I should be furious," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "Every rule I was ever taught, everything my father tried to instill in me about honour and duty, tells me I should send you away this instant." I flinched, bracing myself for the verdict I knew I deserved. He took a step closer, and the space between us became charged, the air thick with unspoken emotion. "But all I feel," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw, aching whisper, "is afraid. Afraid of what my mother will do to you when she has you removed from this house. Afraid of what will become of you." He paused, his gaze searching my face as if he were trying to memorize it. "Afraid of losing you." It was an admission so honest, so vulnerable. It left me breathless. It was everything I had, secretly, foolishly, desperately longed to hear. He lifted his hand, his movements slow, hesitant as if he were afraid I might bolt. His fingers, calloused from work I couldn't imagine, came up to my face and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was feather-light, a ghost of a caress, but a jolt of pure, agonizing warmth shot through me, rooting me to the spot. His face was so close now I could feel the heat from his skin, see the deep, aching loneliness in his eyes. The world narrowed to this single, impossible moment. I tilted my face up. An invitation, a surrender. The promise of a kiss hung in the air between us, more powerful and potent than a kiss itself. It was a silent, solemn vow. Then, with a resolve that I could see cost him everything, he let his hand drop to his side and took a half step back. He had not taken what he wanted, what we both wanted. He had given me a choice. He had given me his trust, even when I deserved it least. And in the quiet, firelit library, with a storm raging outside and a war waiting for us in the morning, that was more than enough. The morning arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling, unnatural stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent, the sky a pale, indifferent grey. The quiet inside Langston Hall, however, was heavy and suffocating. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow, counting down the moments to my inevitable ruin. I remained in my room, a prisoner waiting for her sentence. The memory of the firelit library, of the raw vulnerability in Calder's eyes, and the ghost of his touch on my cheek, was the only thing that kept the terror at bay. He had promised we would face this together. I clung to that promise like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. Just after 10, the summons came. Riggs knocked at my door, his face impassive but his eyes filled with a weary pity. "Mrs. Langston requests your presence in the main drawing-room, miss," he announced. "Mr. Langston is to be in attendance as well." The trial was beginning. My legs felt unsteady as I walked down the grand staircase. Every step was a conscious effort. When I entered the drawing-room, I saw that the scene had been perfectly staged for maximum theatrical effect. Mrs. Langston was seated in her usual high-backed throne of a chair, the very picture of matriarchal authority. Standing nervously by the door, twisting the strings of a small but heavy-looking purse, was the other Evelina Ward. And by the tall window, his back to the room, stood Calder. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a statue of silent, simmering rage. Mrs. Langston began her performance, her voice a symphony of false sympathy, as she addressed the real Miss Ward. "My dear girl," she began, "it seems there has been a most unfortunate misunderstanding. A clerical error at the agency, no doubt. While we are so very grateful you braved the storm, the position you were seeking has, regrettably, already been filled." She gestured to the purse in the young woman's hand. "I have taken the liberty of compensating you for your travel and your considerable trouble. I do hope you will accept our deepest apologies for the mix-up." The real Evelina Ward, who looked utterly bewildered by the strange, tense atmosphere of the house but clearly understood the finality of a heavy purse, gave a small, nervous curtsy. "Thank you, madam," she mumbled. Riggs appeared as if from nowhere and showed her out, and just like that, the living proof of my deception was gone. Mrs. Langston had not exposed me. She had erased her. It was a stunning display of power, a clear and chilling message sent directly to her son. I am the one who controls the narrative in this house. I decide who belongs and who does not. This problem is gone because I willed it away. Now, only the three of us remained. Calder finally turned from the window, and the look on his face was glacial. But his mother did not address him. Her cold, reptilian gaze settled on me. "A fascinating little serpent you are, Miss Ward," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, surgical whisper. "Or whatever your name is. You have managed to embed yourself in my son's affections with a rather impressive display of pitiable vulnerability. But you have severely misjudged the game." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering. "My son's pity for you is a fleeting thing. A momentary lapse in judgment. It will fade. I will see to it." She smiled then, a thin, bloodless line. "He is a Langston. He will remember his duty, his name, and the legacy he has sworn to protect. And you, my dear, are nothing but a temporary diversion, a common little weed in a garden you do not belong in. You will be gone before the first frost melts from the windows. The threat was absolute, a promise delivered with the calm certainty of a hangman." Calder did not rise to the bait. He knew, as I did, that arguing with her was pointless. His defiance was quieter and far more powerful. He walked past his mother's chair without a single glance, his silence a dismissal of her entire performance. He came to my side, where I stood frozen, her venomous words echoing in my ears. "Come," he said quietly, his voice a warm, steady anchor in the cold, treacherous room. "Let's leave her to her theatre." He took my arm, his touch firm and reassuring, and led me from the room. We left her sitting there alone, a queen of a hollow, silent kingdom. Later that evening, I sat in my room, his mother's threat replaying in my mind. "You will be gone." The doubt she had so skillfully planted was beginning to take root. Was I being selfish by staying? Was I truly going to be the cause of Calder's ruin? The urge to pack my single, pathetic bag and slip away into the night was a painful, tempting pull. A sharp knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Calder standing there. The exhaustion was still on his face, but it was overlaid with a new, unshakable determination. He must have sensed my wavering resolve, seen the doubt in my eyes from across the dinner table. He looked at me, his gaze so intense it seemed to silence all the fears in my head. "You are not leaving this house?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a command, a vow. He was not letting me go. Calder's command, "You are not leaving this house," was a shield, and for 2 days I held it in front of me, using it to deflect the silent, venomous glares of his mother. An uneasy, toxic peace settled over Langston Hall. We were in a stalemate. Calder was my constant shadow, a quiet, protective presence that never strayed far. We took our meals together under his mother's cold, watchful eye. We walked the grounds, the damp winter air a welcome relief from the suffocating tension inside. We didn't speak of the future. We didn't speak of the past. We existed only in the fragile, stolen moments of the present. But I saw the cost of his protection. I saw it in the dark circles under his eyes, in the new hard lines etched around his mouth. I saw it in the way the servants would scurry from a room when we entered, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. I saw it in the formal, strained letters that began to arrive from neighbouring families, polite but cool inquiries that were thinly veiled social dismissals. The scandal was beginning, and I was at the centre of it. His mother's words echoed in my mind, a relentless, poisonous whisper. You will be the ruin of him. I had come to this house to save myself, but now the only way to save the man I was beginning to love was to destroy myself, to vanish from his life as completely as if I had never existed. The decision was a cold, hard stone in my chest, an act of love that felt like a betrayal. I waited for the next storm. It came on the third night, a furious squall that threw sheets of rain against the window panes and howled around the eaves of the old house like a vengeful spirit. It was the perfect cover. I packed my few meagre belongings into my small bag and wrote a short, simple note, my hand trembling so badly the words were nearly illegible. Forgive me. It was the only way. I left it on the pillow of the bed that had been my sanctuary. With my shoes in my hand, I slipped out of my room. The house was a beast of darkness and shadow, its silence broken only by the roar of the storm and the frantic, guilty beating of my own heart. I moved like a thief, down the grand staircase, my hand trailing on the cold, smooth banister. The great oak doors of the foyer were just ahead, a dark promise of both freedom and utter desolation. I was feet away, my hand outstretched for the heavy iron latch, when a floorboard creaked in the darkness behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. A single lamp was lit on a far table, and he stepped from the shadows into its weak golden glow. Calder. He was fully dressed, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of cold, quiet fury. He had been waiting for me. He had known. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm leaving, Calder," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "It's for the best." "The best for whom?" he shot back, taking a step towards me. "For you, to run from a fight? Or for my mother, so she can win?" "For you," I cried, the word torn from me, "so she doesn't destroy you because of me. Your name, your legacy." "My legacy is worth nothing if I have to sacrifice an innocent woman to preserve it," he said, his voice a low growl. "After everything we've faced, you would just run away?" "I'm not running away," I said, tears blurring my vision. "I am saving you from me." His face hardened. "You lied to me when you came to this house, Eveline." The accusation, so bald and so true, felt like a slap. "I lied to survive," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was only an arm's length away. The anger on his face dissolved, replaced by a look of raw, desperate agony that shattered my heart. "Then teach me how," he said, his voice breaking on the last word, "because I don't know how I'm supposed to survive you leaving." The confession hung in the air, a truth so stunning and so absolute that it silenced the storm, the house, the entire world. The argument was over. The fight was over. There was nothing left between us but the aching, undeniable reality of what we had become to one another. He closed the final space between us, and the air grew thick, electric. He lifted his hand, not with the hesitant gentleness from the library, but with a fierce, desperate certainty. His fingers cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. The world narrowed to the stormy, searching look in his eyes. And then he kissed me. It was gentle at first, a soft, questioning press of his lips against mine, a moment of profound, breathtaking tenderness. It was a question, and I answered by tilting my head, my hand coming up to grip the front of his shirt as if he were the only thing holding me to the earth. A ragged groan escaped his throat, and the kiss deepened. It was no longer gentle. It was a desperate, hungry claiming, filled with all the unspoken fear and aching longing we had both held back for so long. It was the taste of the storm, the heat of the fire, the quiet desperation of two souls who had finally, finally found their harbour. The sound of the rain against the glass was the only witness to the moment the last of my defences crumbled, and I was lost. The kiss ended, but the storm it had unleashed inside me was just beginning. Calder's hands came to rest on my shoulders, his thumbs gently stroking my collarbones, and he rested his forehead against mine. We stood there in the vast, cold darkness of the foyer, breathless, our world narrowed to the small, warm space between us. The desperate passion of the kiss slowly subsided, leaving in its wake a profound and trembling tenderness. He had not just kissed me, he had anchored me. He had silenced every fear, every doubt, with a truth that was more powerful than any lie. The reality of our situation slowly seeped back in. The cold of the stone floor crept through the thin soles of my shoes, and a shiver that had nothing to do with fear ran through my entire body. Calder must have felt it, because he pulled back slightly, his expression softening with a gentle concern. "You're freezing," he murmured, his voice a low, rough sound. "Come with me." He didn't lead me back up the grand staircase towards the guest rooms. Instead, he kept my hand firmly in his and led me down the quiet, shadowed corridor towards our sanctuary. He pushed open the glass-paned door, and we stepped into the conservatory. The sound of the rain was different in here. On the great glass roof, it was a loud but soothing drumbeat, a rhythmic, steady sound that sealed us off from the rest of the world. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. It was our private haven, and now it felt more sacred than ever. In a secluded corner, nestled amongst overgrown ferns, was a small, wrought-iron bench. He led me to it. Tucked underneath was a thick plaid wool shawl, forgotten by a gardener long ago. Calder shook it out and, with a tenderness that made my heart ache, draped it carefully around my shoulders, his fingers lingering for a moment, where they brushed my neck. We sat down on the cold iron bench, the shawl a warm, comforting weight around me. He didn't release my hand. He held it resting on his knee, his thumb stroking gentle circles over my knuckles. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just sat and listened to the rain, the silence between us no longer tense or uncertain, but filled with a deep, quiet understanding. The war with his mother, the real Evelina Ward sleeping somewhere in the house, the impossible future. It all existed outside the glass walls of this room. In here, there was only us. Slowly, tentatively, I leaned my head against his shoulder. He stilled for a second, then relaxed, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He leaned his own head to rest against mine. It was a simple gesture, but it was the most profound intimacy I had ever known. It was safety. It was peace. It was belonging. We stayed like that for a long time, the rhythm of the rain on the roof a lullaby. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, quiet murmur, barely more than a breath. "This house is full of ghosts," he said, his voice thick with the weariness of years. "My father, Isabel." He paused, and I felt his chest rise and fall with a heavy breath. "But you," he whispered, turning his head so his lips were close to my hair. "You make me forget that I'm one of them." The words were the most beautiful, devastating thing anyone had ever said to me. He didn't just see me, the imposter, the woman with a ghost's face. He saw me as the person who was pulling him from the wreckage of his own past, the one who was leading him back into the light. Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so potent it was painful. As the storm outside began to soften, the first faint pearly grey light of dawn began to filter through the glass. A new day was coming, and with it, the battle we both knew we had to face. But now, for the first time, it did not seem impossible. I was no longer a girl lying to survive. I was a woman who was loved, and that, I was beginning to realize, was the most powerful armor in the world. We lingered in the conservatory as the first fragile light of dawn bled through the glass, turning the silvered moonlit leaves to a soft, hopeful green. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt hushed and new. In the warmth of our small sanctuary, with my head on Calder's shoulder and his hand holding mine, it was easy to believe that we too had been washed clean, that the chaos of the previous night was nothing more than a bad dream. But the peace was a fragile illusion, as delicate as the glass that separated us from the cold morning air. I knew it couldn't last. My joy was a flickering candle flame, and outside this room, a gale was waiting to extinguish it. My mind, now that the immediate terror had subsided, began to race through the impossible maze of our situation. A woman who claimed my name was sleeping somewhere in this house. A man named Lord Pembroke held a letter that could be either a weapon or a salvation. And a cold, calculating woman, who had already tried to murder me once, was now backed into a corner. Calder had chosen me, and the defiant pride I felt in that knowledge was laced with the bitter poison of fear. His choice had saved me, but I was terrified it had also just condemned him. He was choosing to stand by a lie, and the truth was now armed with a letter of employment and sleeping in one of his guest rooms. "We can't stay here forever," I whispered into the quiet, giving voice to the dread that had begun to pool in my stomach. I felt him sigh, a heavy, weary sound. "No," he agreed. He squeezed my hand gently. "But we can stay for a moment longer." That moment stretched into a timeless peace. But eventually, the sounds of the house stirring to life, a distant door closing, the faint clatter of cookware from the kitchens, pulled us back to reality. We stood, and the spell was broken. As we stepped out of the warmth of the conservatory and back into the cold, formal corridor of the main house, our hands fell apart. The alliance was still there, a silent, unbreakable vow between us, but the easy intimacy of the night was gone, a casualty of the coming day. We were no longer just a man and a woman. We were the master of the hall and his scandalous companion, and we were walking into battle. We went to the dining room. It was an unspoken decision, a unified front. We would not hide. Mrs. Langston was already there, seated at the head of the table, a porcelain cup of tea held in her perfectly steady hand. She was dressed in a severe, high-collared gown of dark grey, the very picture of unimpeachable dignity. She looked up as we entered, her expression placid, as if the dramatic confrontation of the night before had never happened. The real Evelina Ward was nowhere to be seen, an absence that felt more threatening than her presence would have. "Good morning," Mrs. Langston said, her voice cool and even. "I trust you both slept well after all the excitement." "I slept better than I have in years," Calder replied, his voice equally calm as he pulled out a chair for me. It was a lie, a perfectly delivered volley in a war that would be fought with polite words over polished silver. The breakfast that followed was the most tense meal of my life. Mrs. Langston did not speak of the other Miss Ward. She did not mention my collapse or the doctor's visit. Instead, she spoke of the estate. She reminisced about Calder's father, about his tireless work to build the Langston name, about the sacrifices he had made to ensure the family's legacy. Every word was a meticulously sharpened dart aimed directly at her son, a reminder of his duty, his bloodline, his inheritance. And with every mention of the Langston legacy, her eyes would flicker to me for a fraction of a second, the message clear. This is his world. You have no place in it. I saw the immense pressure she was putting on him. I saw the subtle clenching of his jaw as he listened, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped his fork. He was letting her speak, letting her exhaust her ammunition, his own anger a coiled, disciplined thing held in perfect check. When the meal was finally over, Calder pushed his chair back. "Eveline," he said, using my name as both a shield and a statement, "walk with me." I knew where he was taking me, back to the only place we could speak freely. But as we approached the glass door of the conservatory, we saw it was already slightly ajar. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. We stepped inside, and the scene that greeted us stopped me dead. Mrs. Langston was standing in the centre of the room, by the ghost orchid. In her gloved hand, she held a pair of small, sharp silver pruning shears. The single, perfect, star-shaped white bloom, the flower that had taken Calder's father a decade to cultivate, the one that had bloomed only once in his lifetime, was trembling on its slender stem. She saw us, of course. She had been waiting. She met her son's gaze, and with a slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating grace, she brought the shears together. Snip! The sound was tiny, insignificant, yet it echoed in the silent, sunlit room like a gunshot. The perfect white flower was severed from its stem. It hung in the air for a single, agonizing moment, before fluttering to the stone floor like a dying moth. It was a symbolic murder, a desecration of his father's memory, of patience, of beauty. It was a message. She turned to us, her face a mask of cold serenity. "It is a shame," she said, her voice a quiet, conversational purr as she looked at the fallen blossom. "To see something so rare, something that took so much effort to cultivate, destroyed because of a common weed that has taken root where it does not belong. A reminder, son, of what is at stake." Her gaze lifted, bypassing me entirely, pinning Calder to the spot. Her voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper, each word a perfectly crafted shard of ice. "If you choose to keep her," she said, with a flick of her eyes in my direction, "you will lose everything your father built. This house, this name, this legacy. I will see it all burn to the ground before I let you give it to a liar and a fraud." The threat was absolute, total war. She would destroy her own family, her own home, her own son's future, just to win. Calder did not speak. He did not rise to her bait. He simply stood there, his face carved from stone, his eyes blazing with a fire that could have matched her own. He looked from the crushed flower on the floor to my face, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second. Then, in a gesture of silent, profound defiance, he stepped towards me and took my hand. He laced his fingers through mine, his grip firm and possessive. Without a single word or backward glance at his mother, he turned and led me from the conservatory, leaving her standing alone amidst the quiet, beautiful ruin she had just created. His silence was his answer. He had accepted her terms. We walked from the conservatory in a charged, unbroken silence, our hands still laced together. The warmth of his grip was a stark contrast to the icy dread that was spreading through my veins. His mother's threat echoed in my mind, a funeral bell tolling for the Langston name. "I will see it all burn to the ground." She had not been speaking in metaphors. She was a woman who would rather preside over a kingdom of ash than see her son happy with a woman she had not chosen. And I was the one who had handed her the torch. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I looked at the man beside me, at his proud, determined profile, and I saw everything he was about to lose. This house, which had been his prison, was also his birthright. The legacy of the honourable, patient man who had cultivated a single perfect flower was about to be obliterated by the very woman who should have been its staunchest defender. I felt like a sickness, a blight that had crept in through a crack in the wall and was now threatening to kill the ancient noble oak from the inside out. He led me to the library, our war room, and closed the heavy doors behind us, shutting out the rest of the house. The room was quiet, filled with the soft morning light and the scent of old books. It should have felt safe, but it didn't. There was no safety left for us anywhere. I pulled my hand from his, the loss of his touch making me feel instantly cold and untethered. I turned to face him, my heart aching with the terrible, necessary thing I knew I had to do. "Calder! You cannot do this," I began, my voice a desperate, trembling whisper. "You saw her. You heard her. She means it. She will ruin you before she allows you to choose me." "She can try," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She won't just try. She will succeed," I insisted, taking a step back, needing the distance to fortify my resolve. Think of your father, of everything he built. You cannot let her destroy it all for my sake. Please, let me go. I will slip away tonight. No one has to know. You can tell them I ran away, that I was scared. It is the only way to save you, to save this house. He looked at me, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, unwavering sadness. My father's legacy is not stone and land, Eveline. It is honour. It is decency. It is the belief that a man must stand for what is right, no matter the cost. He closed the distance between us, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were looking directly into my soul. There is no honour in letting a tyrant win. There is no decency in sacrificing an innocent woman to appease my mother's rage. If I let you walk out that door, if I let her drive you out into the world with nothing after she tried to kill you, I will hate myself for the rest of my life. That is not a legacy. It is a curse, and it is not one I am willing to live with. But the scandal, I whispered, my last flimsy argument. Damn the scandal, he said, his voice rough with a conviction that silenced all protest. And damn the neighbours, and the whispers, and the name. They are all hollow things if we have to become monsters to protect them. He reached for my hand again, and this time I let him take it. He was not going to let me sacrifice myself, and in my heart, a traitorous, joyful part of me was glad. The choice had been made. We would face the fire together. Then what do we do? I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. We are trapped here. We have no proof of what she's done, nothing but our word against hers. And I am a confessed liar. His grip on my hand tightened, and for the first time since we had left the conservatory, I saw a flicker of something other than grim resolve in his eyes. It was a spark of strategic light. No, he said slowly, we are not the only ones with proof. My mind raced, and then I understood. The masquerade. The failed mission that had yielded an impossible clue. Lord Pembroke, I breathed. The man at the ball. He said he had a letter. From Isabel. A letter she sent him the day before she died, Calder finished, his focus now sharp as a razor's edge. A letter begging for his help. It is the one piece of evidence that exists beyond these walls, beyond my mother's control. It is the only thing that can corroborate her own words in the fragment you found. A new, dangerous energy filled the room. The suffocating despair began to recede, replaced by a surge of desperate purpose. We had a path, a single, narrow, treacherous path, but it was a path nonetheless. We have to get it, I said, my voice urgent. I have to get it, he corrected me, his tone leaving no room for argument. I will ride to his estate at once. We cannot send a servant. My mother watches their every move, and we cannot risk a letter. She would surely find a way to intercept it. He looked at me, his expression serious. I have to go myself. Now, before she realizes he is a loose end she has failed to tie. The thought of him leaving, of being left alone in this house with her, sent a spike of fear through me. But I knew he was right. It was our only move. He prepared to leave immediately. There was no time to waste. At the door of the library, he turned back to me, his hand on the brass handle. She will know I am gone, he said, his voice low. She will see it as an opportunity. Promise me you will go to your room, lock the door, and speak to no one until I return. I promise, I whispered. Our eyes held for a long moment, a silent exchange of fear, of hope, of a trust that had become the only real thing in this entire house. Then he was gone. I stood in the silent library, the weight of his mission and his trust settling on my shoulders. I was no longer an imposter or a companion. I was the guardian of a rebellion, a lone soldier holding a fortress of two, waiting for the return of her king. And outside the library doors, I could almost feel the cold, patient watch of the Queen, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I did as Calder had instructed. I locked the door to my room, The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding into place, a small, futile gesture against the oppressive power that saturated the very air of this house. The silence that followed his departure was a living entity, a vast, predatory thing. Every creak of the ancient floorboards in the corridor, every distant rattle of a window pane in the wind, sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my system. I was a prisoner in my sanctuary, and the warden was the most dangerous woman I had ever known. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the weak afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the neglected lawns. My thoughts were not in the room with me, but on the muddy road to Lord Pembroke's estate. I pictured Calder riding, his face set with that grim determination, and prayed for his safety, for his success. He was my hope. He was my only hope. The letter Lord Pembroke held was no longer just a clue. It was the key to our entire future, the one truth that could dismantle the fortress of lies his mother had spent years building. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The quiet of the house was a form of torture, a constant humming tension that frayed my nerves raw. I knew she was somewhere, watching, waiting. Calder's absence was a vacuum, and I knew his mother's malevolent nature, like the physical laws of the universe, would not allow it to remain empty for long. She would make a move. I was certain of it. Then it came. Not a thunderous banging or a furious demand, but a soft, polite, almost gentle knock at my door. Tap, tap, tap. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, my body rigid, remembering Calder's final, urgent command. Do not open it for anyone but me. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would simply go away. A calm, silken voice drifted through the thick oak of the door, a sound as perfectly composed and as utterly chilling as a winter frost. Miss Ward, I know you are in there. There is no need to hide like a frightened mouse in the wainscoting. My son may have left you with dramatic instructions, but this is still my house. Open the door. We must talk. It was her. Of course it was her. I remained silent, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, my knuckles white. Calder's words were a shield. Do not open it. The silence stretched for a long moment, and I allowed a foolish flicker of hope that she might have given up. Then her voice came again, the silken tone now laced with a thread of pure, unadulterated steel. Do not be a fool, child. This is a conversation we are going to have. You can have it on your feet with a measure of dignity, or you can have it after I instruct Riggs to remove this door from its hinges. The choice is yours. I will give you 10 seconds. The threat was not idle. I knew she was capable of it. I was trapped. To cower in my room was to prove her right, to prove that I was nothing more than the frightened mouse she believed me to be. Calder had shown me what it was to stand and fight. Hiding behind a locked door was not a fight. It was a delay of the inevitable. With a deep, steadying breath, I stood, walked to the door, and slid the bolt back. I opened it. She stood in the corridor, a vision of dark, severe elegance. She did not storm into the room. She glided, her movements fluid and controlled. She surveyed my modest chamber with a look of faint, aristocratic disdain before turning and closing the door behind her, the quiet click of the latch sealing us in together. "That's better," she said, moving to stand before the unlit fireplace. "Now, we can speak as two sensible women." She did not begin with accusations. Her first volley was far more cunning. It was pity. "You know," she began, her voice taking on a tone of weary sympathy. "In a way, I almost admire your ambition. To see an opportunity and seize it with such tenacity. I understand it truly. The world is a cruel place for a woman with no name and no fortune. You did what you felt you must to survive." She was trying to create an alliance, to frame us as two women navigating a man's world. It was a disgusting, manipulative tactic, and it made my skin crawl. I said nothing. "But you made a critical error," she continued, her voice hardening slightly. "You mistook my son's pity for passion. You mistook his sense of duty for devotion. He sees you as a wounded bird, a charity case. And while he is a good man, he is, at his core, a Langston. This sentimental fever will pass, and when it does, where will you be?" She let the question hang in the air before closing in for the kill. Her voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper. "I have made inquiries in the village. There is a place, a workhouse, for women like you. Frauds and vagrants. They say the food is inedible, and the winters are particularly cruel. I have a great deal of influence with the magistrate. A single word from me, and you would spend the next decade scrubbing floors with lye soap until your hands were raw bone. Calder would not be able to stop it." Her threat was a vivid, bleak tapestry of my future, and for a moment, the old fear, the fear of cold and hunger, seized me. But then I saw Calder's face in my mind, the look in his eyes in the firelit library. "I am afraid of losing you." That memory was my armour. "Your son is not a fool, madam," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "He is not the weak, sentimental man you seem to believe he is." A flicker of genuine surprise, and then fury, crossed her features. My refusal to crumble had clearly insulted her. She decided it was time to use her final weapon. Not a threat of the future, but a poisoned truth from the past, a secret designed to shatter my faith in him completely. "You believe he is your white knight, don't you?" she said with a soft, cruel laugh. "You think he was some innocent, blinded by grief. Let me tell you a secret about my son, little mouse. Calder knew Isabel was unhappy. She told him herself. She begged him to leave this house with her, to take her fortune and start a new life in Italy. Away from me, away from his duties." She took a step closer, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "And my son, my dutiful son, refused. He chose this house. He chose his name. He chose his legacy over her happiness. He broke her heart long before her heart ever stopped beating. The guilt he feels is not the guilt of a man who was absent. It is the guilt of a man who said no." The revelation was a stunning blow, a truth designed to frame Calder as a man who would, when the final choice was made, always choose legacy over love. She expected me to shatter. She expected my faith in him to crumble, revealing him as just another man who had failed another woman. But as I looked at her, at the triumphant, hateful expression on her face, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't feel doubt. I didn't feel betrayal. I felt a wave of profound, aching empathy for the terrible, impossible choice Calder had been forced to make. A choice between his beloved father's legacy and the woman he was supposed to love. A choice engineered and manipulated by the very woman standing in front of me. This didn't weaken my love for him. It deepened it. Mrs. Langston saw the change in my expression, saw that her final, most venomous gambit had failed. The pity and fear in my eyes were gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. I looked her directly in the eye, my voice clear and calm. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "Now I finally understand the true weight of the burden he has been carrying all these years." The look of absolute shock on her face was a victory. Her last weapon was spent, and it had not left a scratch. I was no longer a frightened mouse. I was no longer a ghost. In the quiet of that room, I had survived her storm, and I was still standing. After Mrs. Langston left my chamber, a strange and profound calm settled over me. Her final, most venomous attack had failed, and in its failure, it had given me an unexpected gift. Clarity. My fear of her, a constant gnawing companion since the day I arrived, had been burned away, leaving behind a hard, quiet resolve. I was no longer a frightened girl playing a part. I knew who I was, and I knew whose side I was on. The waiting that followed was different. It was no longer the passive, terrified waiting of a victim. It was the patient, focused waiting of a soldier. The hours ticked by. The weak afternoon sun dipped below the skeletal trees, and the house was plunged into the long shadows of evening. The staff moved with their usual ghostly quiet, lighting the lamps in the corridors, the small, flickering flames doing little to push back the oppressive darkness. Every sound from the courtyard below, the crunch of gravel, the nicker of a horse, sent my heart leaping into my throat. I sat in the armchair by the window, a silent vigil, my gaze fixed on the winding drive. "Come back," I prayed, a mantra repeating in the quiet of my mind. "Just come back safely." Finally, just as the last of the light had faded from the sky, I heard it, Not the slow tread of a carriage, but the urgent, frantic gallop of a single horse being pushed to its limit. I rushed to the window, my hands pressed against the cold glass. A lone rider emerged from the twilight, a dark, powerful figure on a dark horse. Calder, he pulled the steed to a halt in the courtyard, dismounting with a weary grace that spoke of a long, hard ride. He was back. A wave of relief so potent it made me dizzy washed over me. He was safe. I didn't have to wait long. Footsteps, firm and purposeful, stopped outside my door, followed by a sharp, distinct knock. It was his knock. I flew to the door and slid the bolt back, my hands trembling with a mixture of relief and anticipation. He stood there, framed in the dim light of the corridor. He was spattered with mud, his hair damp with sweat and mist, his face etched with a deep exhaustion. But his eyes were blazing with a fierce, triumphant light. He stepped into the room without a word, pushing the door closed behind him. And for a moment, we just stood there, drinking in the sight of each other, the silent, profound relief of our reunion a palpable thing in the air. He reached into the inside pocket of his riding coat and pulled out a single folded letter, its wax seal a deep, unbroken crimson. "He gave it to me," Calder said, his voice a low, rough sound, raw with emotion. "Lord Pembroke. He said he was a coward for not acting on it sooner, but my mother's influence. He was afraid. He told me he's been waiting for years, praying that someone would finally come and ask the right questions. This was it, the voice from the grave. The final, undeniable proof. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of the moment as Calder took a small knife from his pocket and sliced through the crimson seal. He unfolded the single sheet of paper, his hands surprisingly steady, and began to read aloud. His voice was a low, steady anchor in the silent room, as he gave voice to the words Isabel had written in her last, desperate hours. "My dearest Lord Pembroke," he began, "I write to you in the deepest confidence and the most urgent need. Forgive this imposition, but you were my father's most trusted friend, and I have nowhere else to turn. I fear for my life." Calder's voice faltered for a second, but he took a breath and continued. "For weeks, I have been made to feel as though my mind is failing me, that I am succumbing to a deep and incurable melancholy. It is a lie. I am not suffering from a sickness of the mind. I am being poisoned. The tonics Mrs. Langston insists I drink each evening. They leave a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, and they are making me weaker by the day. She looks at me, not as a future daughter, but as an obstacle to a fortune she believes is rightfully hers." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. It was all there. A direct accusation. "I have tried to tell Calder," he read on, his voice now strained with a terrible pain. "But he is caught between his duty and his heart, and his mother has spent his entire life poisoning his mind against me with whispers of my fragile disposition. He does not see the truth of what she is. But I now have proof. My loyal maid, Rose, has discovered a small, hidden vial in Mrs. Langston's private sewing room, filled with the same dark, bitter liquid she serves me as medicine. We know what it is. We mean to take it to the constable in the village in the morning. Rose is keeping it safe for me. The smoking gun, the reason Rose had to vanish, the final, damning piece of the puzzle. I am writing this to you as an insurance," Calder read, his voice now a raw whisper. "A final plea. If you do not hear from me or Rose by tomorrow evening, you must assume the worst has happened. Do not let her bury the truth with me. Do not let her say I was merely another sad, broken woman. For God's sake, my friend, help me." He finished reading. The last words echoed in the profound, heart-wrenching silence of the room. He held the letter in his hand, this final, desperate cry for help from a woman he had failed to save. I saw the grief on his face, the horror, but beneath it, the last of his own guilt was being burned away, replaced by something cold and hard and absolute. He carefully folded the letter and looked at me, his expression now clear, focused, and utterly determined. "It's over," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I will send a rider for the constable. We will not wait. We will present him with this letter, with the financial documents, and we will bring Clara forward to give her testimony about her sister. And then," he said, his voice dropping, We will take him to the East Wing, and I will demand he open that room." He stepped towards me and took both of my hands in his. His grip was strong, unwavering. "There will be a scandal, the likes of which this county has never seen. The Langston name will be ruined. Everything my father built will be turned to ash. Are you ready for that?" I looked up at him, into the face of the man who had walked through the fire for me, who had chosen me over everything. My fear was gone, replaced by the calm, steady strength I drew from him. "The Langston name is not the ruin, Calder," I said softly. "It's a beautiful house that has been dark for too long." I squeezed his hands. "I'm ready to help you let the light in." We did not sleep. After Calder returned with the letter, we spent the night in the firelit library, the single sheet of paper lying on the polished table between us like a sacred relic. We spoke in low voices, piecing together the last tragic days of Isabel's life, the words from her letter filling the shadows with a grief that was profound and sharp. For Calder, it was a night of painful exorcism, the ghost of his guilt finally being replaced by the hard, cold truth of his mother's betrayal. For me, it was a night of quiet wonder, watching the man I loved shed the last of his haunted past and emerge as the man he was always meant to be. Strong, just, and utterly resolute. At the first hint of dawn, he dispatched a rider to the village with an urgent summons for the constable. There was a new stillness in the house, a profound quiet that was not born of fear, but of finality. The war was over. All that remained was the reckoning. We waited for the law to arrive, but as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, a silent, mutual understanding passed between us. This was not a matter to be left entirely to strangers. This was a family tragedy, and it had to be confronted by the family that remained. "We should not wait for him," Calder said, his voice quiet but firm as he stood and looked at me. "She needs to hear it from me." "I will come with you," I said, standing to join him. I was no longer an outsider to this tragedy. I was a part of it, and I would see it through to its bitter end. We walked to his mother's private sitting room, the heart of her power, the place where she had spun her webs of manipulation and cruelty. We did not knock. Calder opened the door, and we stepped inside. She was there, of course, seated in her high-backed chair by the window, a book of poetry open but unread in her lap. She was dressed in immaculate black silk, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She looked up as we entered, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in her cold eyes. She knew the game was in its final moments. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" she asked, her voice a perfect imitation of aristocratic boredom. Calder did not answer her question. He walked to the centre of the room, a commanding presence of righteous fury. I stood just behind him, his silent support. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but clear, cold, and utterly devoid of the filial deference he had shown her his entire life. He was not a son speaking to his mother. He was a judge delivering a verdict. "For years," he began, "I have allowed you to poison this house with your bitterness. I have allowed you to poison my mind with a guilt that was never mine to bear. But the lies are over." He laid out the evidence before her like a prosecutor, his words precise and damning. "I have reviewed the financial documents from Isabel's estate, which clearly outline your motive for wanting her dead. A motive worth a fortune." Her composure remained flawless, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. "I have taken a formal statement from a maid, Clara, regarding the disappearance of her sister Rose, who was Isabel's confidant and who vanished the same week Isabel died. A convenient disappearance you explained away with a story of theft. A flicker of genuine shock this time. She had never imagined the staff would dare to speak. I have a fragment of a letter," he continued, his voice relentless, "written in Isabel's own hand, found in a book you once taunted Miss Ward with. In it, she speaks of being a prisoner, not a patient." "Forgeries and the ramblings of a hysterical girl," she hissed, her composure beginning to fray. "All of it concocted by this gutter-snipe you have allowed to bewitch you." Calder ignored her outburst. He reached into his coat and produced the Pembroke letter, unfolding it with a slow, deliberate finality. He placed it on the table in front of her. "And I have this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "A final letter from Isabel, written the day before she died. In it, she names you. She details the poison she believes you are giving her. She speaks of the proof she and Rose had found, a vial they meant to take to the constable the very next day. A next day that, for them, never came." She stared at the letter, her face ashen. She read the first few lines, her eyes darting across the page, and a strangled, guttural sound escaped her throat. Her perfect, aristocratic mask shattered, revealing the writhing, ugly face of a cornered serpent. "Lies!" she shrieked, rising from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. "All of it lies! She was a weak, foolish, sentimental girl, unworthy of the Langston name, unworthy of you. And this one," she spat, pointing a trembling finger at me, "she is a whore and a liar who has poisoned you against your own mother." "It is over," Calder said, his voice like the tolling of a bell. And then she broke. Seeing the implacable resolve on her son's face, knowing the evidence was absolute and her power was gone, the years of coiled, venomous control finally snapped. A torrent of rage and twisted self-pity erupted from her. "I did it for you!" she screamed, her face contorted. "I did it for this family, to protect you from a weakling who would have drained this estate with her whims, to save our legacy from a fortune that would have made you her puppet. I did what needed to be done. Rose, the little sneak, she had to be dealt with. They both had to be dealt with." It was a confession, spat at us not with remorse, but with a defiant, horrifying pride. In the middle of her tirade, a firm, official knock sounded at the sitting-room door. Riggs entered, his face pale, his posture ramrod straight. "The constable is here, Mr. Langston," he announced. Behind him, the uniformed figure of the county constable stepped into the room. Mrs. Langston saw him, and the furious, raging energy seemed to drain out of her in an instant. The fight was gone. She didn't scream or struggle. She seemed to collapse inward, her body shrinking, her face suddenly old and hollow. The great, formidable matriarch of Langston Hall was gone, leaving only a withered, defeated old woman in her place. She was quietly escorted from the room, her final exit from the stage she had commanded for so long. Calder and I were left alone, standing in the sudden, deafening silence of the room, in the wreckage of his family. The truth was finally out. The ghosts finally named. But the victory did not feel triumphant. It felt quiet and sombre and immeasurably heavy. I looked at the man beside me, the man I loved, and I saw not a victor, but a son who had just lost his entire past. The house had been cleansed, but now it was truly haunted, and I wondered what, if anything, we could possibly build from the ashes. The reckoning was not a storm, but a quiet, suffocating fog that descended upon Langston Hall. In the days that followed Mrs. Langston's arrest, the house became a tomb. The few remaining servants moved with downcast eyes, their whispers ceasing the moment Calder or I entered a room. Solicitors and constables came and went, their grave faces a constant reminder of the depth of the rot they were uncovering. The story of the Langston tragedy was splashed across the London papers, a lurid tale of a murderous matriarch, a lost heiress, and the imposter who had brought the house of cards crashing down. I was a footnote in the scandal, but a scandalous one nonetheless. Calder was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days locked in the library with his father's ledgers and his nights pacing the long, empty corridors. He was drowning in the wreckage of his family, tasked with the impossible burden of dismantling a legacy built on secrets and blood. We were a united front, but a sombre one. The passion of our first kiss, the tender peace of the conservatory, felt like a lifetime ago. Now, a new kind of distance grew between us, forged not from secrets, but from a shared, overwhelming grief. I would bring him a cup of tea in the library, and he would give me a weary, grateful smile. But the weight of the ruin was a third person in the room with us at all times. I saw the way the villagers looked at him when he rode into town. He was the son of a murderer, the man who had been bewitched by a fraud. They looked at me with an even greater contempt. I was the serpent, the gutter snipe, the source of all their trouble. My presence, which had once been a candle in his darkness, was now a stain on his name, a constant public reminder of the scandal. And I knew, with a certainty that broke my own heart, that as long as I remained at his side, he would never be free of it. He would never be able to rebuild. I made my decision one evening, after watching him return from a brutal meeting with the banks, the weight of the world on his shoulders. My first deception had been an act of survival for myself. My final one had to be an act of love for him. I found him in the library, staring out the window at the darkening sky. I didn't have a bag packed this time. This was not an escape. It was a surrender. "I have to leave, Calder," I said softly. He didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tense. "We have already had this discussion, Eveline." "No," I said, stepping closer. "Last time, I was running. This is different. As long as I am here, you are the man who was fooled by the imposter. I am the face of your family's scandal. You will never be able to move forward, to rebuild a life, with me as a constant reminder of the ruin. You need to be free of it. You need to be free of me." He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were filled with a raw, pleading agony. "I don't want to be free of you. You are the only thing in this entire disaster that has made any sense. And I love you for that," I said, my voice thick with tears. "I love you so much that I cannot bear to be the reason your future is destroyed. Let me go. Let me give you this one thing. A chance to heal. On your own." The argument went on for an hour, but it was not a fight. It was a heartbreaking negotiation between two people who loved each other enough to want what was best for the other. In the end, he saw the painful truth in my words. He could not begin to rebuild his life while the symbol of its destruction was living under his roof. Our goodbye was a quiet, formal agony in the grand foyer, the very place we had first kissed. It was not a goodbye of passion, but of a deep, sorrowful respect. He pressed a heavy purse of coins into my hand. Severance, he called it, for my service. It was a fortune, enough to start a new life anywhere. I accepted it, knowing it was his way of ensuring my safety. "Will you write?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "I will," I promised, "when I find a place to land." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He did not kiss me. He did not touch me. He simply watched as I walked out the great oak doors, out of Langston Hall, and out of his life. Months passed. I found a small, quiet life in a coastal town in Devon, a place where the sea air was clean and no one knew my name. I took a position in a dusty, wonderful little bookshop, the scent of old paper and ink a comforting balm on my wounded soul. I had a clean, bright room above the shop, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, honestly, on my own. I was at peace, but there was a constant, hollow ache in my chest that had a name. Calder. We exchanged a few letters, stilted, formal things filled with polite inquiries about the weather and our health. I read about the Langston estate in the papers. He was selling off large tracts of land, paying off decades of his father's debt and his mother's excesses. He was dismantling the empire to save the home. I told myself he was moving on, building a new life, and that I had done the right thing. But every night, I dreamed of a ghost orchid and a house filled with secrets that had, for a brief, beautiful moment, been my home. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, another letter arrived. The handwriting was his, but it was different from the others. The strokes were firm, confident. It was not a letter of polite inquiry. I opened it with trembling fingers. "Eveline," it began. "The worst is over. The debts are settled. The name is what it is. I have sold the North Lands, and with it, the ghosts of my family's ambition. Langston Hall is smaller now, quieter. The house is undergoing a restoration, both of its structure and of its soul. The east wing is open. The air is clear. But it is empty. I am writing to you not as the master of the hall, but as a man asking the woman he loves to come home. Not as a companion. Not as a secret. As my partner. As my equal. As my future. Please, Eveline, come home to me." My journey back to Langston Hall was the reverse of the one I had taken what felt like a lifetime ago. I did not travel in a dark, closed carriage filled with the suffocating scent of lavender and my own nerves. I sat in a bright, clean train car, the window wide open, letting the crisp, cool autumn air whip through my hair. The English countryside, which had once seemed a grey, misty landscape of dread, was now a vibrant tapestry of gold and red and amber. My heart, which had trembled with the guilt of a liar, now beat with the steady, joyful and slightly terrified rhythm of a woman going home. When the carriage from the station turned onto the long, winding drive, I saw it. Langston Hall. It was no longer the colossal watching tombstone I remembered. The autumn sun warmed its grey stone, and the skeletal, clawing branches of the old oaks were now ablaze with colour. The house looked smaller, somehow, less imposing. It looked like a place that was healing. The gardens were no longer overgrown, but neatly tended, and there was scaffolding on the far side of the west wing, a quiet, hopeful sign of restoration. It was a house that had survived its ghosts and was learning to breathe again. The carriage pulled to a stop, and he was there. Not Riggs, but Calder. He was standing on the top step, waiting for me. The haunted, weary man I had left behind was gone. The deep lines of grief and strain around his eyes had softened. He was not smiling. Not in a broad, easy way, but a deep, quiet joy radiated from him. A sense of peace that seemed to settle the very air around him. He walked down the steps to meet me as I alighted, taking my single small bag from my hand and setting it aside as if it were of no consequence. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms, and I walked into them without a moment's hesitation. He held me, not with the desperate passion from the night of the storm, but with a profound, steady strength, a quiet claiming that spoke of all the lonely months we had endured. I buried my face in the familiar clean scent of his coat and breathed him in. I was home. When he finally pulled back, it was only to take my hand. "Welcome home, Eveline," he said, his voice a low, warm sound. My name, my real name, spoken on the steps of the house where I had lived a lie. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He didn't lead me into the grand foyer. Instead, he kept my hand in his and said, "Walk with me." He led me not to the library or the gardens, but down the long, quiet corridor to the east wing. The thick rope of dust was gone. The air was no longer frigid and stale. At the end of the hall, the great imposing oak door stood, but the heavy dark beam that had barred it shut was gone. Calder reached out, turned the simple iron handle, and pushed the door open. Sunlight streamed into the hallway. The room, which I had imagined as a dark, dusty tomb, was airy and bright. The heavy velvet curtains had been taken down, the furniture removed, the windows thrown wide open to the autumn air. It was just a room, a beautiful, empty room, scrubbed clean of its sorrow. The ghosts had been set free. Calder looked down at me, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Every secret in this house tried to keep us apart," he said quietly. "It's time to let them rest." He closed the door, and we left the past behind us. Finally, he led me to our sanctuary, the glass conservatory. It was bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon. The chaotic jungle I remembered had been gently tamed, the paths cleared, the glass panes so clean they seemed to disappear, leaving only the blue sky above. New life was everywhere. In the place where the single tragic ghost orchid had stood, there was now a riot of brilliant, joyful colour, vibrant pansies and cheerful chrysanthemums that drank in the sun. The house was alive. Calder led me to the centre of the room, and there, surrounded by all that quiet, determined life, he pulled me close. He wrapped his arms around me, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. His chin came to rest on the top of my head, and he held me, not with passion, but with a deep, abiding peace. This was not the desperate finding of a harbour in a storm. This was the harbour. The truth had nearly destroyed us. The lies had nearly buried us. But what survived was stronger than stone, deeper than any secret. It was a quiet, steady, and unconditional love, a love found in the darkest of places, a love that had been brave enough to fight its way into the light. And here, in the warm, golden sun, I knew it would last forever. In a house built on lies, love was the first truth brave enough to stay.